I didn't anticipate that beard length would be the first thing that we talk about, but there we have it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, I am going to jump right in because I know that this is going to go,
Yep.
and I want us to start first a couple of introductions. Both of these guys have been on the channel before, Kale Zelden and Brett Salkeld. And this comes in the wake of a recent conversation I had with Brett, and I just this morning was re-listening to my conversation with Kale, and I am really looking forward to this talk today. And now you two have never spoken before, correct?
This
This
is
is
our
the first
first.
time.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Maybe both of you do a little bit of introduction, and then I'm gonna jump us right in.
Sure.
Go first, Brett.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to hear Kale's interpretation of how this happened, because I'll include that in the introduction because I think it'll be interesting for the audience. So, basic biographical stuff. I'm Archdiocesan theologian for the Archdiocese of Regina. I run our diaconate formation program up here. I'm a married man, 7 children. Living the dream in Regina, where it's recently come above minus 30 centigrade. So our front door was frozen shut. Like it's like the polar vortex in Regina is as cold as you're gonna get almost anywhere.
Oh my gosh.
And happy to be a guest here, sort of every once in a while with Paul. And what was interesting to me, I read the comments, after, and I refrain from engaging because I just think it's like it's quicksand, right? Like if you get into it with people who are critiquing strangers on YouTube, you're dead,
Yeah, but Brett, that's because you say clear and forceful things. See, like me, I just sort of speak in sort of ambiguous language, and I throw off some thoughts here and there. People don't really not sure what to sort of sink their teeth into. You're too clear. That's your problem.
Yeah, so I just paint a bullseye right in the. So the interesting thing was, leading to this, is someone said, I'd like to see Brett talk to Kale. And I didn't know who Kale was, so I went and found the video and watched like Kale's interview with you and read the article that you wrote for 1 Peter 5 that was kind of in the background there.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because what happens in the comments is I'm generally, lots of people are appreciative, but if people don't like me, I'm a liberal. I get attacked for being a liberal, which is like, which is sort of, I was thinking about this, like, okay, so I'm a single income father. My wife homeschools our 7 children. I write books in favor of the church's teaching on things like human sexuality and commending doctrines like purgatory and transubstantiation to our ecumenical partners. But apparently the fact that I call them ecumenical partners instead of, like, I don't know, heretics or something.
Right. See, yeah, you're checking all the boxes. You're checking clearly all the liberal boxes here, Brett.
It's really strange. It's like the Overton window has gone so far, but I think the Overton window has split.
Yeah.
I think there's 2 Overton windows, and in the faithful Catholic camp, I'm now far left, which is like the weirdest thing in the world. Because I don't have like an angry hermeneutic of suspicion against the Pope or something. Like that's not the marker for Orthodoxy. It's very weird.
Yeah, it reminds me of that quip. What is it? I think it's St. Jerome who says, the world groaned and woke up and realized that they were all Arians. And, I think we have awakened and realized that apparently we're all either completely, hardcore trads or complete, loosey-goosey liberals. And like there's no main thoroughfare there.
It's super disorienting. Yeah. And so anyways, the pitch is made that I should have a conversation with Kale. And I'm thinking, does this mean he's the hardcore trad who's going to, bring it down on me? Or what is this? Then I read it and I saw that 1 Peter 5 and I thought, well, maybe he is, not the article, but just the mention of the website. And then I went and read the article and I was like, I think I agree with most of this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I never, of course, in my adult life, never considered myself, a trad, in with a trademark next to it. But I find myself in a sort of a strange position now, based in large part, I think, just on the sort of the loud, noisy chatter, out there. I find myself in a sort of a different space.
Right.
And I think, and we can get into this, of course, but, I think in large part, this is driven by either the perceptions of Pope Francis or real things that Pope Francis has done or not done. So I think there are reasons for it that are probably worth teasing out.
Right. And I'll just say, I suspected that the person making this suggestion wanted to see me get my comeuppance from a proper trad.
Oh, geez.
I
will disappoint that person, I'm afraid.
No, but that I was wrong. They were not. They were in fact very perceptive. They in watching you and watching me saw, I think this is what I got from watching you and reading your stuff, is that we're actually really close in a lot of ways. But on a couple of key things, we seem to come from different angles or different sides. And that actually makes for an interesting conversation. Whereas if you were a trad to give me my comeuppance, I don't know how much good that would do.
Sure.
But the fact that we like, when I read about your upbringing in the church, it was remarkably similar to mine. But then around that sort of coming of age period, we have some different experiences that inform us differently. That I think set us up for how we respond to the current situation in the church. But it means I think we have the same language and experience enough to understand one another. So that's, at that point, I emailed Paul and said, like, I'm actually kind of interested in having this conversation. Whoever suggested it is not crazy and not just looking, to give me my comeuppance, but actually, I think, saw something perceptive. So let's see if we can't prove him right.
Great. That sounds good.
So you now, Kale. Introduce yourself
sorry.
a little bit.
I forgot about that. Yeah, so my name is Kale Zelden. I am a teacher. I work at a boarding school in Rhode Island and cradle Catholic. Left the church in somewhat histrionic fashion around the age of 16 through around the ages of 18 and a half. I read my way back into the church during my freshman year of college at LSU. In Baton Rouge, and then I decided to pursue a more intense Catholic liberal arts education at a small little college in New Hampshire called Thomas More College. After Thomas More College, I went back to LSU, got my master's degree in English, and I've done a variety of different things. Everything from writing, I wrote for a regional golf magazine, to worked in kitchens, to golf courses, to the classroom. And I even spent 5 years working and writing in Hollywood. So nothing produced. So there's no IMDb page. I was trying my hardest. So at any rate. And Paul, I should say that's probably the reason, that is where I spent the most of my time in sort of interdenominational settings. And I think that was already by temperament open to those kinds of conversations. But I think that solidified my eagerness to have these kind of conversations. And I think that drew me, or rather that kept me at your channel when you were one of the earlier Christian commentators on Peterson. So that's how I found you, I think.
Well, and I've where to go with this, because you two, just by yourselves, I know you two can go off and you two can have a really interesting intramural Roman Catholic conversation. And I am here to sort of help all of the non-Roman Catholics listen in and understand what's going on. And I re-listened to our conversation this morning, Kale, because I wanted to refresh myself on your story. And I found, everything that you brought to watching conversations, watching myself in these conversations is so painful for me, because I realize how bad I am at it.
Oh, that's funny.
But, so here I'm doing it again.
Yeah.
We have, and I wanted to start this out with the mention of Ravi Zacharias.
Yes. Good.
Because I think this situation with Ravi Zacharias, even though the authority and institutional dynamics out there in parachurch evangelical land, and what you and I talked about, Kale, and what you wrote about with respect to that article, in terms of what do we do when a cardinal, this is a cardinal,
right,
when we have a scandal of this magnitude. And the reason I think we're seeing really interesting things going on in this space today is that there's an overall continued reassessment within Protestantism of the merits of that movement. But at the same time, we're seeing within the Roman Catholic Church a lot of struggle. And Kale, a lot of what you had said to me in that conversation just opened my eyes to stuff that I never would have seen. But listening to it within the Roman Catholic context reminds me of all these little things happening in even a little place like the Christian Reformed Church and all of the internecine struggles. And so I wanted to hear the both of you, because I respect both of you deeply and think you're both such good faith partners in conversation, and you're both great talkers. So I didn't want you two to just veer off into, the trad drama in the Roman Catholic Church. And I knew you wouldn't, because I have a sense of that. But I think we are in a moment of within the church, what happens with Ravi Zachariah for evangelicals is in many ways parallel to the tremors in the Roman Catholic Church because of these scandals. And Kale, I thought you so put your finger on it with respect to where does this leave me? And where does this leave someone who deeply, and both of you two have such strong credentials. I mean, neither of you are leaving the Roman Catholic Church. It's not going to happen. Right. So I wanted to bring that in so that all those non-Catholics out there, and hopefully the Orthodox in the process don't get too smug as they listen in, because
I think they're doing pretty well right now. But anyway,
But on this question, no one can afford to be smug, right? Because this is a human problem. This is minor sports. This is schools. This is families, and anyone who imagines that their community is untouched by this is probably in for a rude awakening, because the worst setup is the imagining that it can't happen. And the kind of making excuses around the power dynamics that let it happen. Yeah. Now, I was at a Catholic Evangelical Dialogue meeting in Mundelein Seminary outside of Chicago. And there was an evangelical who had written a book, and I wish, if I would have known this was going to come up, I would have got his name and the name of the book. But essentially, it was a book about power dynamics in evangelicalism. And a big thing I remember was the danger of the superstar pastor, and particularly the loneliness and the utter lack of accountability in so many evangelical structures for the superstar pastor. And of course, you have to make allowances for the differences of structure when you go over to Catholicism, but the basic human pattern of sin works out in remarkably similar ways, no matter what the external ecclesiological structures look like, and the kinds of excuses we make for people, and the way we lie to ourselves because we don't want to see it and let it go on. It's going to happen. It's going to happen in every community. It's what are we going to enable it, or are we going to have structures and capacity for addressing it quick and honest?
Yeah, and on that, Brett, I was struck by the wording coming out of the Ravi, the Zechariah accounts, and it was always, if you speak against, the pastor, it's going to hurt the work, right? It's going to hurt the work of the Lord, and you see that same, language anytime there's a sort of a superstar priest or a superstar theologian who sort of has this kind of moment, the sort of a in-house status rocket stuff that you talk about all the time, Paul. You run that risk of being more important than the truth, right? And I remember, I forget who said it to me at some point, but basically, Kale, Jesus doesn't need your lie. And I think that every one of these superstars is essentially set themselves up as Jesus needs my lie. Like the work that I'm supposed to be doing for Jesus is just going to have to absorb the fact that I own multiple massage parlors in various corners of the globe. Right. And not to pick on Ravi, because, our own church has got tons and tons of those versions. But it's always that same note. And you can see the temptation of those that sort of exist on that next level, because the work really is important. and to your, Brett, your work is important. Like you're a single, you're the income earner for your family. Like your work is not inconsequential. So therefore, there's something deeply invested in the structures that allow you to do your work, which do in fact have somebody at the sort of the top of the pyramid, your bishop, I would assume. So it almost becomes it's almost a miracle when it doesn't melt down from the top.
I think you're exactly right. It is so tempting. I have to remind myself, and one of the ways I remind myself is I say it out loud when I'm teaching ecclesiology to teachers or deacons or whatever, is that like in the history of the Archdiocese of Regina, I'm like maybe a footnote.
Right.
Never mind in the history of the Catholic Church, right? But it can feel every day like what I'm doing is so important that if something were to happen, I can understand the temptation to want to cover, And I remember, so here's one thing that I think was different about my experience of McCarrock and other things than yours. When I was a teenage boy, I found out that the priest who baptized me had serially abused my uncle for years. And it was front page news in our little corner of the world, and it broke. I mean, it was a decade or two before Boston broke in the States and whatever. And so my own coming to terms with membership in this church happened, earlier, and had that like dose of realism about these kinds of things, that when I remember very clearly when John Carape fell, and for people who don't know,
I'm glad you brought him up. I was thinking of him actually.
John Carape was before social media was what it was, right? Back when you got cassettes to play in your car, recordings of talks given in parishes. John Carape was near the top of the heap in Catholic land, and he was EWTN's sort of frontline guy, and he was telling everyone, traditional Catholicism, and let's toughen up and let's do the,
kind of a manly, rigorous, cold shower Catholicism.
Right, exactly. And it broke that he had this like ranch with like drugs and prostitutes and fast cars and whatever else. And lots of people in my circle were shattered by this because he was their ideal of a Catholic priest. And I was like, yeah, I'm surprised this didn't happen sooner. Like, the way he was carrying himself was just so.
Anyway. Well, the word is smug, right? I mean, I think the smug word. I was reading something just today, and Flannery O'Connor has a letter that she was writing, I think, to Brett and to the Fitzgeralds back in the day, the translator of the Aeneid, and anyway. And she says something like, she's talking about another Catholic priest, and she says, "Oh, I like this guy. He doesn't have that thing that seems to be endemic to every Catholic priest of some kind of prominence, which is smugness." And I think that word smug follows this whole thing around. And Paul, I don't know what, I knew who Ravi was, even as a Catholic. Is that a fair, now looking back on it, sort of label, or what do you think of that?
Well, I Ravi among his cohort was better than average. Okay. Even though people didn't know about these things. And there's a lot of conversations out there. I think I could probably pull up the name of the guy, Brett, you're talking about with respect to this. There's a lot of conversations out there with respect to power dynamics, with respect to celebrity. It doesn't take away from the fact that it's the pastor of the 2-bit storefront church, sleeping with the women, or the local Catholic priest who has little or no status. This isn't simply a question of the way that smugness or status can bleed in. There are deep questions about how the message is compromised. And what I like about bringing Ravi into this is that, so the Protestants have their sola scriptura, which tends to get beat up among my Orthodox friends now. And the Roman Catholics have their structure, and the Catholics and the Orthodox and the Pentecostals love to talk about submitting to authority.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is that we have I think it goes deeper in that we assume that this gospel, whether you instantiate it in sort of a sola scriptura evangelical frame or a historic apostolic succession structural liturgical frame, this doesn't inoculate our superstars against the most common weaknesses we all bear with. And you can find, you just go out there and find salt of the earth Christians, Roman Catholic or Protestant or otherwise, who are out there sacrificing and being faithful and embodying it and giving justifications that says, it's hard, but it does work. And again, I often come back in these conversations too. I know you're doing a podcast, Kale, with Rod Dreher. I mean, his story is so, when I first heard his story, that to me was so indicative of this moment. But then I did a conversation with a young woman who grew up evangelical, and the Jordan Peterson thing, went to Orthodoxy. And
I love that one.
Finally, she's frustrated with the mask business in her Orthodox church. She sits down in her front yard, opens up her Orthodox study Bible, only to realize, I'm being a Protestant again.
Yeah,
and
I love that moment. That was great. I saw it. It was wonderful.
And so I think it's sort of like, once you see something, post-modernity, once you now are a consumer deciding, I'm going to be Roman Catholic, just coming to the church in that way at all makes you Protestant. And so a lot of these conversations want to focus on sort of low-hanging fruit culprits. Oh, it's the celebrity. Oh, it's the human nature. But I think there's more here in terms of where can finally we trust. Protestants sort of say in Scripture we can trust, and Roman Catholics sort of say in the church we can trust. Now, obviously, one would say in Jesus we trust, but this is where, when I look at, say, the drama between the trads, and I didn't know any of this stuff. You maybe should describe a trad for me, but I think, Brett, in your intro, you sort of did well. I mean, if Brett Salkeld is insufficiently down with the church, I don't know.
Well, I think that the trad versus everybody else frame, depends so much on what has happened in the last decade. And really what has happened, I think, in terms of the Roman Catholic Church, what has happened in the last decade is really set up by what happened, at the council. And not even really what happened at the council, but really kind of what happened as an aftermath of the council, So
and when you say the council, you mean Vatican II?
Yeah, the Second Vatican Council, which is what, Brett, 62, 63, 64, I think it is?
And 65, yeah.
It's 65, right. It was there were 4 sessions, that's right. And so I think that so much of my own sort of resorting of what I thought was true versus what I don't know it's true anymore is the way in which the Second Vatican Council was taught to me in the 90s, was this very, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, or then Cardinal Ratzinger inflected, triumph of what, I'm sure Brett knows is the hermeneutics of continuity. That despite some of the sort of the more heterodox aspirations of some of the council participants, and some of the early euphoria in the aftermath of the council, that John Paul II sort of brought it kind of back to its sort of main thoroughfare and sort of made it a little bit more robust. So there's kind of a small c conservative interpretation of the council. And I think that for me, at least, largely held throughout my adult life. Brett, is that?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, So
And I just want to say one more thing. And
Yeah,
it was definitely preached at me that the Second Vatican Council was great, and that and again, it's such a loose term, Paul, as I'm sure Brett will correct me here, because you have the documents of the Second Vatican Council, which have standing in the church in terms of the magisterium of the church, and then there's this other stuff that people call like things that came out of the council, right? And so it can be a little slippery, right, Brett? I mean,
yeah. I mean, so my experience growing up was.
Why don't you, Brett? Why don't you explain, because you're so good at this?
Yeah.
Explain the Second Vatican Council, where it came out of, and because, I mean, again, my conversation with you, Kale, when you begin talking about and describing what's going on, it was like, oh, because this is far bigger than just what's happening in the Roman Catholic Church. We're talking about huge forces that are reshaping our world and continue to do so. But go ahead, Brett.
Right. Yeah, and I will get to a point where I think my interpretation differs from Kale, and that'll be interesting. But I mean, so the Second Vatican Council, called by Pope John the 23rd, meets from 1962 to 1965, issues 16 documents, grows out of, in large degree, post-World War II crisis in European Catholicism, right? When John the 23rd is calling it, there's a bit of a narrative that like, oh, Catholicism was trucking along just fine. Why did he have to mess with anything?
Right.
No.
And this is my critique of the trads too, by the way. I totally agree with that.
So I mean, church attendance is already dropping in Europe. There's a major crisis in meaning, obviously, following the Holocaust and the reckoning around that, all that kind of stuff. There's also movements in liturgical theology in particular, but also ecumenism and what we call ressourcement, which is a rediscovery of the fathers of the church that are brewing in the first half of the 20th century, that sort of come to expression in Vatican II. And it's famous for the single most obvious thing to most people is that we stopped having Mass in Latin and started having it in the vernacular,
right? Which has nothing to do with the Second Vatican Council,
which is
technically.
virtually not. I mean, the liturgical constitution suggests that we might do that sometimes under certain circumstances.
Yet it happens virtually overnight.
Right.
So that's an interesting,
But lots of the bigger questions are things like, well, let's frame it. The larger question under which most of the things fit is the question of the church's relationship with the world beyond the church. And so there's questions about relations with non-Catholic Christians. There's questions about relations with other religions. There's questions about the relationship with civil society and these kinds of things. And what happens in the, I would say, first 20 years or so after the council is the interpretation that is prominent in Catholic universities, diocesan offices, whatever, is sort of a more and more open and very optimistic spirit in terms of what the church is able to engage with the world. And what John Paul and Benedict start sort of moderating that with is a sense that we still need to hold on to some distinctive, like if we're going to be salt for the world, we can't just be, indistinguishable from the world. And so that's one way of sort of in very short order, giving a bit of history.
Yeah. So this is why I think, we look at something like Rod's, the Benedict option, so much of that is driven by the concern that, we no longer have anything to give. And I'm talking broadly here, as he calls the sort of the smaller Orthodox communities, right? That we've become so divorced from anything substantive that we're in danger of sort of losing any connection to our traditions, and therefore there's some sort of sense that we need to return, to bolster our own communities in the oncoming onslaught, right? So I do think that there are certain analogies that have sort of come back again that make this relevant. relevant. And you call it a kind of optimism. I think that people, and I'm not necessarily arguing for this myself, but I think other people would look at what the church does to itself in 1962, 63, 64, and 65, and then with the liturgy in 68. Is that right, Brett? I think 68. That this wasn't optimistic. That this was painfully naive.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there were people and interpretations that were painfully naive. How much to attribute that to this or that person or to the church at large or popes or whatever is, I mean, you got to do a lot of digging and make your case on this or that. But I wouldn't disagree that there was naivete at play for sure, right? And then I think what largely it comes down to with John Paul and Benedict and going forward, and the generation, Kale and myself, were really influenced by these guys and the church in that time, is the balance between a sort of robust Catholic identity and the question of our engagement with the world, and right. Trying to figure out, and these are too, in my view, these are too often seen as a kind of zero-sum game. So if we're gonna be ecumenical, that means being less Catholic somehow, or if we're gonna be more Catholic, that means being less ecumenical. And I feel like this kind of false dichotomy, and that's just one example of it.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Underlies a lot of our polarization in the church right now, because I mean, my sense is I've taken part in high level, rigorous ecumenical dialogue, and virtually never, except from people who come in with this funny idea that ecumenism means watering down your identity and your claims. And
why do you think that's funny, Brett? Why do you think that's funny?
Why are their ideas funny?
Yeah, that the concern about something being watered down.
I think people who think it should be watered down, who come in trying to do that, that's a funny idea, because it's not. First of all, it's completely unproductive in terms of dialogue. If you don't come in there with a sense of who you are and what you stand for, dialogue gets boring real fast. And second of all, because it's just not what the church encourages when it tells us to do ecumenical dialogue. So apart from a handful of people who have this funny idea that ecumenical dialogue means watering down the faith, it's rigorous, and you come out more integrated in your own faith commitments, and sometimes that leads to agreement with the non-Catholic partner, or more agreement, and sometimes it leads to just more clarity about where the disagreement is.
But do you see why people might be cynical about ecumenism?
Well, so, I'd like to sort of redirect it.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry, yeah.
Because there's a real, when I listen to your story, Kale, and now Brett, your story about your uncle, I think part of this story is an institution like the Roman Catholic Church, when it's having centralized pronouncements such as a Vatican Council, and here this is then going to come down to the churches. We're living in a context in which other structures are having a far greater impact on the life of the local church than what is happening in a centralized hierarchy. And Protestants are obviously aware of this, because many Protestants have given up on any kind of centralized authority structure completely, and are sort of riding the waves. Because Kale, when I listened to you and I listened to others, that it sounded like their view of the Second Vatican Council from their place in their pew in their local church was a sea change. And then when I listen to for people who have credentials and position within the hierarchy explaining, listen to Bishop Barron, oh no, this was about this, and the distinction you make, Brett, about you're talking about things that are happening in rooms full of people with serious educations, and the vast majority of people are in church for an hour or two each week, and in the rest of the world they're immersed in first newspaper and then radio and television and now cable television, now social media. And so there's a real question as to, well, these people with credentials or vestments can say what they want, but as a Protestant, not paying a whole lot of attention, admittedly so, before any of my YouTube stuff, to what happens in the Roman Catholic Church. You know, yeah, Pope John Paul, he was, you know, the fall of communism, Ronald Reagan, he was a big guy. And then Pope Benedict, I had no idea who he was because Mary hadn't started talking to me about his book or anything like that. And then he retires and it's like,
what? Yeah.
What's that? And then Pope Francis, and then the press are all over the place. And Protestants are all over the place hailing Pope Francis because, and then when I listen to what he says, it's like, no, wait a minute here. This is the Roman Catholic Church. Now suddenly he's a liberal, you know, and so from an outsider who knows just this much, watching these changes whoosh through the church, and even listening to someone like Bishop Barron talk about, you know, suddenly I saw Roman Catholics and the charismatic Catholics, and then you know, it even makes it into a Simon Garfunkel song about the radical priest. So, you know, there's a lot going on here besides just what the powers that be within their halls are making decision when what's going on in the pew is looking pretty wild.
Yeah.
Can I try answer Kale's question in light of what you just
said? Yeah, because I think they're connected. I actually do think they're connected, Brett.
Yeah, I mean, so absolutely. I've seen people say things about ecumenism. I mean, so much of my job is correcting these popular misconceptions that I think, well, if that's what you think ecumenism is, then the trads are right to condemn it. And so much of what I see from my chair in my office is like how the liberals and the trads basically agree on their interpretation about the split and just disagree about which side is right. Yeah. But my sense is that the dichotomy is a false one. But and the bigger question, and this I think goes to your comments, Paul, is does the church have the voice to communicate its worldview when we're immersed in so much other media and other thought that my sense of what happens is the division and the polarization in the world basically gets replicated inside the walls of the church. Yes. And so the interpretive tools we have for thinking about church teaching, we generally don't use them. We use the tools that the world gives us for thinking about things like liberal and conservative in our political categories. Then we apply them to a question like ecumenism, and it's like you're gonna get a mess because the categories don't work. So I think this is part of the problem is we no longer set the terms under which our own theology or public teaching or whatever is discussed. So if we want to say something about same-sex marriage in contemporary culture, it will make zero sense according to the categories of the culture. I think it makes a lot of sense according to traditional Christian categories, but all the work you have to do before you say anything about same-sex marriage is to lay out the categories that the church is using to think about this. And this is a huge part of my work when I give talks on anything, is to try to get the Christian people to see in Christian categories first before you go into any kind of controversial topic.
I'm a little bit more skeptical. I've heard that line a lot, Brett, the business of, you know, that you can't simply graft on liberal and conservative onto sort of church matters. And I bought it for a long time. I'm not sure if I fully buy it now. I'm a skeptic. I don't have an answer to it. I'm just a skeptic about that.
So tell me why, and maybe
let me throw onto that a second before you answer, Brett, because we do the same thing in the Christian Reformed Church, and we're having this, and now we're having fights you guys won't have because we're Protestants. And so so in the Christian Reformed Church, we're trying to have a conversation about human sexuality, and a conservative report just came down, and it's very much along the lines of the Christian Reformed Church. And I just think it's not going to make a difference. Nobody's going to read it. Those
Okay.
categories that people are thinking out there in the world are too dominant, and we're going to need to think of a way to engage this world in a very different way than we have been. So anyway.
Okay, so the reason why I'm skeptical on this, is I'm kind of a cynic about it. The way that Paul's laying it out is that, look at all of the euphoria in both the secular mainstream media, the major outlets, ABC, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, mainstream stuff. Look at the way that they are treating President Biden right now. And look at the way in which, the establishment Catholic press is treating President Biden right now. I'm talking about, like the Commonweal. I sort of use as my basic example of the establishment, leftish mainstream media in Catholicism. I mean, they're very, very excited about this moment, right?
So, well, I mean,
they're very excited, right? Because Joe Biden goes to mass on Sundays.
Right.
We're told all the time. I mean, this is great. And look, I'm glad he goes to mass. I believe in grace, so amen. I hope that it has the necessary effect, right? But I'm also not an idiot, and I can clearly see that. And again, Paul knows me enough to know, like, I'm not some sort of partisan flamethrower. Like I love what you said in your last video with Paul about we're always a party to evil or participating in evil, right? It's just like, how are you going to frame it in the least bad way possible, right? And I think that's exactly right. I agree with you 100% about that. So I'm not a partisan flamethrower in that respect. But it is staggering to watch people use these labels as like, well, now that we have a Catholic president in office, okay, so technically speaking, yeah, they're right. But look, what does that phrase even mean? This is one of the notes that I wrote to myself this morning on my walk. Like how elastic is that category? And I'm making no pronouncements on the president right now. I just want to be clear to the audience. But how elastic is that category? That you to be Catholic, and maybe we can even broaden that out to be Christian.
So, well, a couple things that really stand out for me in that idea. The first is, I wonder what the establishment Catholic media actually is, because I don't have the numbers, but
it's fringe.
I just read a piece by Mary Eberstadt.
Yeah, I read the same piece.
Open letter to President Biden, where she pointed out that Ignatius Press is the largest Catholic press in the Anglosphere.
Yeah, but okay. Hold on, Brett. You work in the official Catholic Church,
right? Well, so okay. Here's
all right. Okay. So you work in the official Catholic Church. You know that the people who staff these places, and maybe Regina is different, but down here in the lower 48, when you work for the chanceries, et cetera, chances are you're an aging boomer, and you love the Democratic Party. You know that's true.
Well, so this is what's fascinating for me, right? So from where I sit, I see that people on the right think that the left-wing Catholic media is dominant. And I'll point to things like Commonweal. People on the left are sure that EWTN has been the most influential force in American Catholicism in 20 years. And they're not both completely wrong. Mm-hmm. But it's fascinating, and the other thing I see in my office is people on my social media. If you're right wing, you think the American episcopacy is hardcore lefties, and if you're left wing, you think the American episcopacy is hardcore righties. But
again, it depends upon what you mean by the American episcopacy. Are you talking about the bishops' conference? Are you talking about the actual individual bishops? I mean, those things matter, right?
Well, so when you get down to distinguishing, the people on the left will say there are a handful of courageous left-wing bishops, McElroy in San Diego or
Supich in Chicago and Tobin in
in a sea of conservatives, and the same and on the other side there's a handful of brave, too bad we lost Chaput now, or whatever.
Yeah.
There's a handful of brave conservative bishops in a sea of left, right. And it really around this, is abortion the preeminent issue?
Sure.
I saw both sides were so convinced of a narrative that when what happened, the bishops said it was preeminent, and then they congratulated Biden when he was elected. And
McElroy got up in the middle of the plenary session and said it's not preeminent, and a couple of those crew got up and made some stink about it.
And that's the handful interpretation on the left. But
who all get to go to Rome and take pictures with the Pope right now, right?
Sure.
So Chaput can't go up and get a picture with the Pope right now. And again, Paul, this might sound so silly, but like those pictures that come out of the Vatican, like those are hugely consequential for people who follow this sort of stuff.
Well, it's just interesting to me because, like the highest Christian Reformed official in the land was probably Betsy Devos. And
that's funny.
I can't tell you just how that played in my denomination.
Right.
Daughter of Prince Corporation, married into DeVos. This is money royalty in the CRC. We have all our own stuff, and so then evangelicals, because we're all too small, but you guys play in the big leagues. And so, but listening to you go back and forth, all of the dynamics sound very familiar.
Yeah.
So what both of you said.
Well, I wanted to finish the thought, which was when the bishops did. Yes, there were voices in opposition, but the bishops did say abortion is preeminent in their official documents. One group on my Facebook thought that was the worst thing, like that was terrible. And then when they congratulated Biden on his victory, the opposite group thought that was terrible. And my thinking was, I agree with the bishops on both counts, actually, but there are exceptions within the bishops' conference on both counts, granted. But I thought as a whole, I agreed with both those moves, and the interpretation was this is a guaranteed knockdown argument that the bishops are, in the first instance, wildly conservative, and in the second instance, wildly liberal. And I just thought they can't win, even if as a body it was the exceptions that were wildly conservative or liberal. It didn't matter. Because no matter if you stood to the left of the bishops, they're hardcore right wingers, and if you stood to the right of them, they're hardcore left wingers. And to me, that's a major difficulty in any ability to have a conversation, because we've got these labels for each other before we get anywhere. That I don't think you can point out specific instances, but as a whole, I don't think they help.
This again brings back where we started this conversation, that Brett Salkeld is, father of 7 children, single. This is at play far beyond the Roman Catholic Church in our culture. It's just that you all have the size and the heft and the reach that you have someone sitting in the White House. And it goes into the question, and I completely understand you, Brett, because in many ways, I see the same thing. And the CRC has two wings that are, shelling into the middle, and everyone into the middle thinks, if I'm going to stop getting shelled on, I've got to go to one extreme or the other. But yet there are deep issues underneath here that have to be addressed. And of course, one of them is questions of what Kale said. What does this label mean? The Joe Biden, or not even just the label, even the behavior. Joe Biden is a he faithfully goes to mass.
Right. And think about it this way, Paul. It's like, I'm let's say I'm a Catholic father of, whatever, 3 or 4 kids, and I send my kids to the local parochial school, and I build houses, right? And wake up in the morning, I say my prayers, get my kids up with my wife, we get them out the door, they go to school, and I go onto the site and I do my job all day, and I'm an honest, faithful person, and I go and I do that sort of thing. I'm a good and faithful builder of houses, right? In the way that that is because I show up to Mass on Sundays, I say prayers with my children, I'm doing my best to raise my kids Catholic in this world, right? And so I don't think that I don't think anybody's going to fight. I mean, now, Brett, maybe you and I could sort of on a Facebook page see what, Joe the Builder really thinks, which I think is always an under-remarked upon phenomena, that we actually know what people think now, which I think is probably the real issue. Because we used to sort of wonder what people thought and were blissfully unaware. And it turns out we were, well served not to know what everybody thought about every subject that they post on Facebook, right? So that's part of it. But, the president is not a builder of houses. The president is engaged in high level work, that is setting the tone for the polis, right? For the country. Like, those things are massively more consequential than whether or not you elect to use the treated or the untreated 2x4 on the roof work.
I want to go into I like the idea of we see what people think, but before we get there, I mean, so I'm profoundly disappointed in Biden's stance on a handful of issues. Abortion, number one among them. Real concerns about religious freedom and those kinds of things, right? I feel like part of what's going on in the mainstream, whether it's Catholic, the left Catholic or the mainstream media, in the sort of glorification of Joe Biden, the Catholic, I feel like it's and this is just my gut. I feel like there's two things going on. One is like a sense of complete and utter relief after 4 years of Trump.
Fair enough. Yeah.
When I read CNN now, like CNN, my right-wing friends say CNN is biased. It's just as left-wing as Fox is right-wing or whatever. I'm not sure it's the same kind of thing as Fox is on the right, but I can see their point, and it's getting more and more that way. And I feel like it was largely Trump that pushed them that way, or their reaction to Trump. I think there's a massive relief among a large segment of society that's showing itself in this way. I also think that sometimes this relief is taking the form of an almost thumb in the eye.
Oh, yes,
like,
absolutely.
We are so done with Trump. We are going to pretend for a while,
right,
that the new guy has no problems. And so, I think that's part of what's going on. But I also think, and this goes to your point about knowing what everyone thinks on Facebook.
Yeah.
I think not only do we know what our neighbors think, and I'm there's friends I have at the gym that I just don't add on Facebook because I don't even want to know.
Yeah.
I don't have any reason to be suspicious of them. I don't want to know, and I don't want them to know about the things I have discussions about on Facebook, because right now we have a perfectly good relationship at the gym. Right. And who knows what might be out there. But I think there's another layer beyond what it is that people think, and now we know about it. It's that what they are thinking is being wildly shaped by social media.
Yeah.
And I'm clearer on this by watching people I knew before social media. So if I watch my parents engage on social media, I know that the kinds of things they post are really a bad representation of the kind of person they are. If all you saw that was their Facebook, that wouldn't be a good picture. But it's slowly seeping into their lives more and more. And so I think part of it is the feedback loop with the social media that's actually, if you were slightly to the right, you're going to get pushed further and further. And this is why there was an Overton window that is now split. And so that there's rigid orthodoxies on the right that make me into a liberal, but there's rigid orthodoxies on the left, and
that make you a raging conservative.
Yeah. I don't even count over there. But the algorithms are rewarding extreme behavior because algorithms don't care about truth; they care about reactivity.
Sure.
And the more extreme the content, the more reactive. And so I feel like a lot of people who I would have disagreed with a little bit on a little things. Now we're getting further and further apart. I mean, and so I think the
Yeah,
view.
okay.
Yeah, go ahead. You go ahead.
I was just going to say on that point, though, we have as Paul keeps reminding us, like we have this massive structure of an institution, right? That is it's the original multinational, right? And it operates as if Taylor Marshall is like the worst thing, that challenges like its viability. And Paul, he's a trad YouTube influencer. I don't know what you would call him, right, Paul?
Yeah,
Brett.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's very trad. He's a convert he was an Episcopalian priest, converted to Catholicism at some point, elected not to become a Catholic priest, and is a teacher, and has turned himself into a little industry down there in Texas. It looks like. And so the power structure.
How evangelical of him!
Well, yeah, it's very entrepreneurial. Yeah. Well, that's what a lot of the cradle Catholics who lean more left are all over that.
Sure.
That one, yeah, that's what he was never really Catholic in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Which again goes back to that interesting question
right.
that I keep posing: what does that mean, right, to be a Catholic in this instance? But so Brett, so to your earlier question, I think I'm trying to connect these things, but whose fault is this, right? That if nobody listens to the bishop, whose fault is that?
Right. Yeah.
You brought this up in the last video. It's like. And so I know you're sympathetic to this line, but you have to lay some responsibility, deep responsibility, at the feet of the men who actually run the show.
Yeah, it's there. I think there certainly is responsibility. I see. So social media is really interesting in this regard, because so at a diocese we have to do social media, right?
Of course you do.
But we can't do the practices that get you the most reaction.
Of course.
Right? So we literally can't do the sensationalizing, extreme polarizing kind of stuff that generates audiences. So we make videos with our bishop or we share content or whatever, and we get in a lot of times a significant reaction from within the mainstream, but we actually can't go toe to toe with someone like Taylor Marshall.
Sure.
It's built so that you will lose if you play his game, right? And so I was talking to a bishop the other day, not my bishop, if anyone wants to.
Don't look it up.
Not my bishop, and he said he was talking to a local YouTuber in his own diocese who's getting big numbers. And the YouTuber was telling the bishop, look, if you just talk in this way about these topics, you can have these. This can all be yours,
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny.
And the bishop said, I can't. First of all, I can't do that. But second of all, if you're chasing those numbers, you might want to consider whether you're using the algorithm or whether it's using you.
That's a great point. It's a great point. I like that. But still, I mean, okay. It's about reach, right? I mean, it's about reach.
Well, to come back again to this question of the thing itself, or the thing that works, to bring in the Protestant story, there was a time and place when Martin Luther was the devil himself, and the printing press was new, and would
I was just about to bring up Luther for you. Well, you beat me to it. I was
And so, Luther had to be gotten rid of, but the politics was such that he wasn't. I think the crisis that we see, whether it's embodied in the sexual scandals of the evangelical marketplace or the Roman Catholic hierarchy. Right. And I think one of the powers of Trump was that Trump,
the end around. It's the end around. He went around the major organs. Absolutely.
He said, Joe Biden, I mean, that was his sell. Joe Biden isn't going to tell you exactly what you think. And I think the deplatforming of Donald Trump from Twitter was probably, might become one of the probably more consequential than if he had been convicted by the Senate.
Amen. And watch, there's going to be a reaction, a counter reaction to his being dumped from Twitter. Watch. I mean,
Right.
Did you see, I don't know if you guys saw this, but he returned home from Mar-a-Lago playing golf yesterday, and there in his motorcade going back to his house is lined with the streets are lined with people applauding him on his way. I mean, he's being turned into Luther in an interesting kind of way. Anyway, sorry.
But my point in this is that there's what this sort of creates is a deep suspicion that maybe there's nothing really there in terms of
Right.
this faith and belief, and
Right.
maybe all there is the juice we get from and this goes before social media. So I think it was, I forget what year, it might have been James Scopp, who teaches English at Dordt College or now Dordt University in Sioux Center, Iowa, at the 150th anniversary of the Christian Reformed Church. The heart of his piece, he had written a little bit before, a family history of the CRC, was that we have lost the ability to basically manage our own weather. And what you said before, Brett, is we are all just proxies of the far bigger movements going in and out. And that was before, 2007 was the first iPhone, and that iPhone
07,
deeply linked to social media and that power that went out. And so there's a deeper angst under all of this that impacts Christianity, not just the Roman Catholics, not just Protestants, and Orthodox, it's coming for you too. That impacts all of us in terms of, is this faith that we possess deep enough to possess us more than our limbic reactions to the algorithms that are now pushing our buttons?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing I would half agree with Kale on, that, and I'm going to come back to what you're saying here, Paul. So I think there are some people who are really worried about Taylor Marshall, myself included. I've seen some, sad things happen with people who are quite obsessed with watching him. But the temptation is to say we need to defeat that. And I think, and that's the limbic reaction, I think, Paul. And I think the wiser pastoral move is to say, what is he speaking into that we're not speaking into?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question.
Speak into that. And so one thing that's become clear to me, well, I hope it's becoming clearer. I'm starting to think about it. I read a great article. I put in a lot of work trying to figure out how conspiracy theories work.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of great stuff out there. We actually know pretty well how they work. What we don't know nearly as well is how to work against them. And there's a big gap there. But I read something recently that said one of the single biggest factors that lead people to conspiracy theories, whether that's Taylor Marshall's, infiltration of the church, or whether that's COVID, vaccines are going to make you infertile, or whatever it is a lack of a sense of agency. And so being able to not get a vaccine actually feels like doing something. When the world is evil and out of control, not getting a vaccine means I can take a stand. And so I'm trying to think now, the more sort of emails I get or whatever, to say, okay, what can we offer these people as to give them a sense of agency and belonging and participation? Because I think, and the pandemic has really exacerbated this, along with social media. It's kind of a perfect storm. But anyways.
But I think it's connected. I think it's connected to something that Paul talks about all the time. I think it's connected to the meaning crisis, and because conspiracy theories work insofar as they have explanatory power, right? Because lurking just behind the conspiracy theory is nothing means nothing, and here I have latched on. I talking about infiltration, right? I don't want to get into the book itself, but at the end of the day, it offers a kind of explanation of why things really stink now. Things are really horrible right now, and why. And rather than getting into sort of impersonal forces of like, well, the GDP is this and this has been outsourced, and but which are, I get all those things. What these things provide is there's a reason, and I think it gloms on to whatever those synapses that fire when you see things line up. You're like, oh, that's why.
Something.
Yeah, right.
It's not only an explanation; it's a prescription.
Yeah.
Right? Like, follow this YouTube, buy this coffee mug, share this link, be part of the solution.
Yeah, Ravi. Yeah. I won't say his tagline, but yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
But it comes when in
okay.
ways,
I'm sorry. Can I
go ahead?
I was just going to say, so, remember, my frustrations as I sort of sit back in my relative obscure perch over here in the smallest state in the union and just sort of watch all this unfold online is, the people in positions of power, look at a YouTuber as if it's the YouTuber's fault. I mean, my goodness, seriously, you're going to blame Taylor Marshall for why, Aunt Betty's nuts? How about, the reason that Aunt Betty is nuts is she's been abandoned because you've abandoned your teaching authority. No, well, it's Taylor's fault. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and carry Taylor's water for him. I mean, he's doing just fine by himself, right? But he is not the cause. There might be a little feedback loop thing on the back end of it, but he is not the cause. And I get frustrated with sort of institutional thinking, that will point the finger at that, because this is, to me, it goes back to, again, something that Paul talks about, is this is sort of about institutional integrity and a crisis of credibility.
We might disagree about how big the feedback loop at the back end is. And I'm going to want to say, certain people who participate in this are sometimes even acting in bad faith and monetizing people's anxiety. And I think it can be a form of spiritual and financial abuse. But I don't disagree. But even if we had a small disagreement about the size of the feedback loop, I would basically agree in a very similar way to how I would say Donald Trump is not the cause; he's a symptom.
Amen.
And there's bigger issues now. Then you beg a further question. Okay, so the bishops or whoever was in charge of American politics before Donald Trump, or whoever is supposedly in charge of this environment in which this symptom emerges, how much control do they have, and what could they or could they not have done? That's a tricky question. I think there's lots of things bishops could have done better. I am sympathetic as someone who works in an office when a certain question or crisis happens, and we're discerning what a best response is. When I go into a bishop's office in a meeting, a bishop has a 10,000-foot view. Sure. And has a range of considerations that are beyond my experience, which can be paralyzing. And I'm sympathetic to that. We try to work. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a scene in The Mission, right? And the cardinal or the archbishop travels to the New World, right? And he's a grandee, right? And he goes and he sees, the church on the ground. I mean, what more stark image of that church on the ground than these, indigenous peoples that are there's a beautiful scene where they're singing as if they're like the Vienna Boys Choir, and it's beautiful. And the only thing that's different is the costumes, right? And so in that moment, the bishop, that cardinal, again, I'm sorry, it's been years since I've seen the movie, but the image just popped in my head that, he has been so far removed from what Francis would say, he no longer smells like the sheep he's supposed to shepherd, right? Which I think is a great line. I don't know if Francis coined that himself or whatnot, but it's great, right? That my concern about the hierarchy is that they are so far removed from Aunt Betty that Aunt Betty looks at somebody like Taylor Marshall and says, "That's feeding me because I haven't been fed for a really long time." And so I'm sympathetic to that elevated view that you talk about. Look, I do administration work, so I understand, I understand, like, it never looks quite the same way. The story is always a little bit different when you know all the facts. I mean, I'm very comfortable with that level of ambiguity. But I think that the abandonment, and this is what I was talking about in my piece on 1 Peter 5, is the sense of abandonment. Right. That is a real thing. And I don't know I don't think there's an easy solution to that. But
well, I'd like to get back to the agency and participation, because I think that's really key, because we are now living mediated by enormously powerful tools, by multi-billion-dollar corporations, by brand new technology. I mean, we have a novel virus in terms of social media, not unlike we have a novel virus in terms of COVID.
That's great.
And all of that is giving people a sense of agency and participation. Now, you might say, well, you're famous on YouTube, and I'm little famous on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram. You've got all of this, I'm being seen a certain way. And so you've got all of that over here. And whereas perhaps generations ago, someone who was that Joe the house builder, who had, he's going to have religious, and as a local pastor, you have a pretty good idea of the menagerie of religious and political opinions that are floating around and the people you talk to all the time, which will keep you humble as a preacher. But Joe the house builder participated in the drama that resolved the deep anxieties and tensions and anxiety and of heaven and earth, of this life and the next, of the redemption of all things and the restoration of God's good creation. And in going to the church every Sunday morning, he participated in that drama. And now, in a sense, we see a competition between that and how many likes I'm getting. And if I put it that way, it totally feels, well, why should these two things be in competition? But we're just little creatures that, ding, 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 ding. We're like that little pigeon in the box, that's in the Skinner box, that's, click the button, get a treat.
Well, one of the things that strikes me from both Kale's last question and comment and yours is it's really hard. Here's a paradox. It's really easy to know what one person thinks on Facebook, or at least it seems easy. Yeah. Even it may not be a super accurate representation of what they think. But it's really hard to know what the larger group thinks. So let's say I'm a bishop and I have a handful of contacts with people in the pews. I mean, I spend a lot of time in meetings and I have to read a million things that come out of Rome and whatever else. And I'm moving from crisis to crisis, but I also have, a solid subset of people in my diocese and beyond that I have a relationship with, that I get to hear about what their struggles and what's going on in the church and whatever else. And what I don't know, and what's really easy to be mistaken about, even though you wouldn't even know if you're mistaken, is how representative my subset is of the broader group. So I get a letter from someone, or the bishop gets a letter and he sends it to me, and we look at each other and say, is this an individual who is a one-off, but is very sort of, vocal and engaged because they're maybe anxious or energetic or whatever, or do they represent 2,000 people that we've never heard of? Right. And that is, it's really, really hard to know that. And so when you're doing communications or whatever on different issues, you're, in a lot of ways, you're testing your audience as you go, because you know a tiny subset and how they're likely to react and what they're looking for and where they might need to be challenged and whatever else. This happens on social media all the time. I'll post something and I'm engaging with people who find it interesting and it looks like the conversation is going somewhere. And then someone who I don't even imagine is reading it comes flying in off the top rope. They are livid about, I don't even know what, I didn't see it coming at all. Now translate that into a bishop or a bishop's conference or whatever. It's hard. It's really hard to read the tea leaves out there.
Right. So there's always the dynamic, right? I mean, maybe this is the paradox that Paul can see as a Protestant, and you and I can't see it as Catholics, is that, we have both, the hierarchical church with, the Pope on top, and we also have the principle of subsidiarity, where, you're supposed to be sort of radically local. And, maybe Paul, a Protestant church, sort of spends more time on that side of the spectrum of things, and maybe we should too. I don't know.
Well, it also strikes me, Brett, that your poor bishop, I've got a lot of feeling for him right now.
I'm starting to get nervous that I'm saying too much, but
your poor bishop is look at what he's fighting against. Because when we say, well, Google knows what the people think, well,
right.
What is Google?
Right.
Is right. Google the shareholders? Is Google the programmers? Is Google the chief officers? Or is Google the algorithm? And, this is where, a lot of talk on my channel, a lot of thought goes into me in terms of, extended agents and persons and proxies and principalities and powers. I mean, we have language for this from the New Testament that your bishop is dealing with. Facebook, if you read some books came out fairly early on from Google about what do we learn about people, and the dating websites do that. There's a really good video from iCupid that says, everyone's a little bit racist. And again, as a pastor, that doesn't surprise me at all. All the men are interested in the 20-year-old women, and the women are disgusted by that in the men. And I mean, this is common knowledge, but we are dealing with forces that are tremendously powerful. And in terms of, and I deal with this personally because I have to ask myself, should I have a YouTube channel? Mm-hmm. And my YouTube channel is quite small in terms of YouTube standards, but I wrestle with, who should I have on and how should I use it? Because I am playing with powers and forces that are, that are far beyond me. And how do I do so faithfully?
No, but I love that question, Paul. And I again, one of the reasons why I love you is you ask that question. You genuinely engage in the question. I mean, I think about this as a teacher all the time, right? So I'm a teacher. I teach at a fancy, lovely boarding school, and it's very expensive, which means that I get to have like 12 kids in my classroom. Right. And so I teach my couple of sections, and I've got, and it's an intimate group, and we can do amazing things with the stuff that we get to read together. It's a genuine blessing. But I think about that all the time. If I were interested in such things, I mean, how would I scale that up? And what gets lost and what gets gained when you scale that up? Right. And, but then I remember that even the classroom is a technology of scaling up. Right, it's a break from a one-on-one, and so I have to ask myself, am I serving all 12 kids in my classroom right now, or did I miss out? Did I focus on the smart kid who really likes the same geeky ideas that I do, and did I neglect the poor kid in the back right-hand corner who's like kind of disaffected, right? So, so I think, so you always have to ask that question. We ask it with our own children. We ask it. You're a pastor in your congregation. That's scaling it up, isn't it? Right? So I don't think we should get paralyzed by the question, but we really have to keep asking that question all the time. So then you look at somebody like Brett's boss and his confreres, right? That's talk about the burden. I mean, I used to say that, and I meant it. It's like I would never want to be a bishop. The awesome responsibility of being a shepherd of multiples of thousands of souls must be a thing that you can't think about too much, or it would just sort of blow your mind, blow you up. And so do YouTubers, influencers, et cetera, when they screenshot their subscribers and it's like reached 100K subs, and I'm watching it, I'm kind of laughing at because I'm that guy. I watch things and I'm like, wow, I could imagine me, Kale, getting really into that. Right. And, I do a little bit of this stuff. Right. And I could see myself really getting into the analytics, I started jogging during COVID, and I was a real couch potato until COVID started. So I started to jog, and I jog every day. And I had one of those little Fitbits, and it was connected to my phone, and it would map out my. And I was and I would post it on Instagram, like, wow, and I was genuinely proud of myself because I was a real couch potato, right? And so I would go 10 miles on a Sunday morning before Mass, and like I was super proud of it. And then I started to realize I'm kind of addicted to. Am I showing off? Am I signaling? Clearly I'm signaling, right? I'm not dumb enough, I'm signaling, but what is my motivation here? And so finally I had to take the Fitbit off. It's not good for me because some days, you know what? It's okay to walk with the dogs. I don't have to make sure I get my run so I can take a picture of it and post it, and I could see myself getting into the analytics of it, which robs it of, well, what am I essentially doing? Like, what is real?
Well, and to swing back to Vatican II.
Oh yeah,
and
I love it. I
want to see how this goes. Yeah.
I know. I'm so excited, Paul.
Because again, from someone who knows very little about Vatican II, to hear, Brett, your treatment of it in terms of, understanding the post-World War II crisis in European Catholicism and understand, okay, how do we, and then, okay, mediated by Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, here, but then this other side, and others heard, what did Vatican II mean? Very low resolution.
Yeah.
Oh, we can have church in the vernacular, whether or not that was connected to it, because I know this is how church communication goes, because I watch that even in a tiny little group like the Christian Reformed Church. You can have church in English, and now we're going to be strumming, it's like the 60s revolution. I've talked about Tom Holland on my channel. I mean, I'm really happy that one of the next books he really wants to do is something on the 60s because
great, it's so important. I totally agree.
Here's this whoosh that goes through the culture, and now suddenly we no longer have to be the uncool church that has masses in Latin and all of the tapestries. I mean, the Protestants had been beating up Catholics for that on their own. But then, of course, now the really cool Catholics are going to Latin Mass. And,
so I got to jump in on this one because when I think of the Second Vatican Council, I really don't think of the Second Vatican Council. Like in my head, and we all recognize the distinction here, but in my head, it has everything to do with liturgical reform in the late 60s. Because, Brett, you're a theologian. I'm not. Everybody, again, full disclosure, Kale is not a theologian. But you and I both know that we're two of a very small group of people who've actually read the documents of the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah.
So what do we do with that phenomenon, Brett? Do you think I'm right about the liturgical reform being the thing that people think of when they think of Vatican II?
Oh, yeah. Before you read the documents, you imagine that was the main thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And then when you read, particularly Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the decree or the Constitution. Sorry,
Constitution.
The Constitution on liturgy. It does not read like what you were told Vatican II did with the liturgy.
Right. So right away. So one more time, you've got the phenomena of the documents. And then you've got the actual thing that people experience. And so you brought this up earlier, Paul, right? It's like, yeah, fine. There's like this beautiful book and there's this thing in the documents and it's written in Italian and Latin and English and it's, promulgated simultaneously everywhere. And then there's like the real thing, and I would argue that that's a kind of baked in decadence that I don't think we've come to terms with as a church. Now, I'm talking specifically here with Brett here, like in terms of the Roman Catholic Church, we have yet to come to, think of all the beautiful encyclicals that John Paul II wrote. I've read almost all of them, and I'm sure you've read all of them. Like, wonderful, inspiring. Benedict XVI, Spe Salve, I know you recommended it to Paul, while back. I love it, but there's that, and then there's like the thing that Aunt Betty encounters in her real life. By the way, I don't have an Aunt Betty, but the thing that people actually encounter, like so when I start talking about what is real Catholicism, you tell me.
Right.
Well, and this is one of the things that I've been really thinking about a lot in terms of Catholic and Protestant. because it fascinated me that when I look at the Roman Catholic Church, now on one hand, you've got the buildings. Boy, those are powerful.
Yeah.
You've got the drama around the liturgy. You've got the
but even Paul, you're dealing with, even that is not entirely accurate, right? Because I grew up in a suburban parish, and if I would take you to that suburban parish, like the actual building, you'd say this is not what Our Lady of Cathedral looks like. So much happened architecturally, liturgically, in song. I mean, again, there's a real disconnect, right, Brett? I mean, between those sort of high church versions of Catholicism that you see in movies, was not the church that you and I grew up in.
Right. So you've put me on an interesting kind of hotspot, which I mean, basically I've been on it without realizing I'm on it very clearly, which is, I mean, the reason I have a job is because there's all this beautiful teaching that nobody knows. And so
that's why you need to be here.
That's right.
Right. So, I mean, like, I tell people, like, if my job is technically infinite. Right. I mean, I could just do it all day, every day.
Yeah.
I could do talks at every parish. And the number one thing I hear when I give talks is some version of, how come no one ever told us this before?
Amen. And that was exactly my experience when I was 18 years old and I started reading old things, and I'm like, well, heck, nobody told me this stuff before.
Right. So on the one hand, I need to remember that the church I live in, Brett the theologian lives in, is a little bit idealized.
Yep.
It's analogous to the Hollywood Catholic Church that Paul and other non-Catholics see with our beautiful liturgies and beautiful.
Yeah. There's what we watch on TV.
And I teach teenagers every day, and so I can see exactly what reality is in terms of whatever gets filtered down.
Right.
Through there. So maybe that's a reason why I'm a little bit of a, I don't know, I hate to call myself a cynic because I am not a cynic, but I'm a little bit, skeptical.
Push back the idealist a little.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here's what I'm, on the one hand, I think you're right. And I think one of the things I learned on the job here, because I was trained in the ivory tower, right? Grad school, whatever. And now I answer letters from parishes and whatever. And so I'm having to learn the real church on the ground. And the thing is, it's so big that, just like the example I gave with the bishop, I learn more and more about it. And I still, so much of it is a vast mystery to me. Sure. What people think and what their experience is, even after years of talking with these people and meeting with these people and whatever. So I need to remember that I'm in the ideal, in a way. The flip side is, my sense from church history is this has always and everywhere been the case.
Yes.
And so they're kind of imagined, like, oh, once upon a time there was a church where everyone was on board and everyone agreed.
That's right.
Everyone did all the things, and we just need to get back to that. And the reason we're not there is because the bishops have abandoned their charge, or the theologians have gone liberal, or the 60s,
or the social media has come in.
Right. So
there may be some truth in this or that part of it as relates to this or that part of our contemporary experience, but there was never a golden age.
Right. This is why we honor
Thomas Aquinas. Maybe Thomas.
Well, I was just going to say, this is why we honor our heroes, right? This is why we honor our avengers. This is why we honor those guys we call saints. I mean, like Francis of Assisi is probably the most famous Catholic saint. Everybody knows who Saint Francis is. Whether they understand what he was or not is a different story, but everybody knows who he is. And all he did was remind the removed people who ran the show that, hey, like, you forgot the core, you forgot the thing, and you need to remember the thing. Right.
Well, and you could find similar characters from every era of church history.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where there's laxity, where there's overreaction, where there's corruption, And so I mean, part of, I guess, one thing that I came to terms with when, as a young man in the church knowing, about the abuse crisis in a personal way as a kind of earthquake in our family was, I've never had, even if as a theologian, I live in a bit of an ideal world in terms of like, I love church teaching and it's beautiful, whether or not everyone knows it and understands it and believes it. I've never been much of an idealist in terms of like, now that we have the right pope, the church is going to be fixed. If we do liturgy right, the church is going to be fixed. Like, that's just never been a temptation for me,
I would agree. I'm the same way. I am not a worshiper of men, but I will say this though. Certainly, I have been cured of any kind of latent ultramontanism that I may or may not have entertained in the 90s, and given the last decade. But also, I think I thought I was sufficiently girded to deal with the corruption in the church after Boston. Like I thought I had kind of mentally sort of done it, right? I mean, I'm from Louisiana, and like literally like the first tremor of the sexual abuse eruptions were, in the next town over in Lafayette, in the 80s, right? So I'm not as close to home as your situation, Brett. So I thought I had kind of sufficiently, girded myself for it, but for whatever reason, the McCarrock thing, blew me up. And not because, oh my gosh, a priest is, doing this. We there's plenty of examples of that, right? But maybe it's because he was so high up. I don't know why that one in particular wrecked me, but it still wrecks me right now. I mean,
Is it possible? I could be totally wrong, but just like watching your previous talk or reading your article, is it possible that it's the relationship with John Paul II? I mean, the impression.
Yes, it is. That's very possible.
Yeah, I mean, in your story, John Paul's this great hero, and so the McCarrock thing says is even John Paul screwed this one up.
Well, and so, but maybe I didn't make that point more forcefully in the piece, but I mean, I love John Paul II. I think he was, on the whole, a great man and certainly an inspiring man. But I also, I'm deeply skeptical. I was deeply skeptical of the rush to canonize him. I'm a sort of a minimalist when it comes to that process personally, even though he was a very, made a lot of sense. Maximalist. But I guess I underestimated how well someone like McCarrock could game the system, and what that means is that the system is much more corrupt than even I had thought it was.
Right. Yeah. I listened to a book by John Teal, and it was largely about Benedict's papacy, but he had the story of Messiel.
Oh, yeah.
In that book.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, I wasn't shaken in the sense of like my relationship with the church.
Right.
For whatever reason, I was ready, and I knew he was a monster.
Right. Yeah.
But like hearing the details was like nausea inducing.
Yeah.
Like the capacity for evil was really sort of overwhelming. And I read something as someone who went to the small town where McCarrock is holed up and like knocked on the door and did the interview. I don't know if you read the interview.
Yeah.
But reading the interview with McCarrock, where he's just like, yeah, I think they've kind of misunderstood me and overplayed a few things. It really wasn't quite like that. Yeah. And it's just like, yeah. I mean, so at the personal, like at the level of shock at the personal evil, I still can be overwhelmed by that.
Yeah.
At the like, when we teach church history to the diaconate candidates here, we used a textbook that was pretty candid about failures in church leadership over the years, and it scandalized a lot of people.
Yeah.
And
what book is that?
Oh, I think it's Justo Gonzalez's church history. Where do I have it here?
A lot of my people like books, and so okay.
Yeah, Justo Gonzalez, Story of Christianity, volumes 1 and 2. Anyways, like it doesn't pull any punches, and lots of people are scandalized because a lot of people in diaconate formation have pretty idealistic pictures of the church and don't expect that kind of thing in church history. And it's actually, part of you is like, oh, I don't like to burst their bubble.
No, you got
to. The other part is like,
you have to.
You cannot go into ministry with an idealized picture of the church. Like, it's really good that you know this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
You'll get out of it fast.
Ministry or the mindset, one or the other.
Right.
Well, and to me, it comes round back to we have heroes of the faith, and we need them, and we should have them. We all need them as part of our own development, but something in all of us longs for, again, the thing itself. We long for salvation, not just from the political woes of the moment or long-term crises or the cancer that's in me or in my mother or my neighbor. We long for the salvation of everything, and we long to participate in that. And go ahead.
Yeah, no, it is a participation, and it is a communion, and it is not just myself. And I think that every time I'm tempted to sort of make this about, it's just Jesus and me, right? Which is a temptation, right? Like this is a sort of it's just me and him,
right?
And everything.
Jesus sees the world just like I do.
Yeah, right. But I know that it's not just me, right. And that's why this stuff matters to me personally.
And I think this is what we're longing for, and this is part of the reason why we, again, on the Protestant side, well, we're going to take the Bible, and the Bible's going to be it because the church has failed me, or
sure.
Well, I read these things in the Bible that make me nervous, so my bishop will tell me what's right. Or
it's a strategy, right? I mean, it's a strategy to take the complicated and make simple.
Yes.
Right. So we can talk about tradism as a strategy. We can talk about, progressive or wokeism in and outside of the church as a strategy. And I think for people, I'll speak for myself, but I get the sense in talking to you two gentlemen that, that it's more complicated than these prepackaged things that are being given to me. It's more complicated. But I guess the reason why I'm way more trad sympathetic than I ever was in my 20s and my 30s, and even into my early 40s, is that I have the sneaking suspicion that the trads are more right than I ever thought they actually were. And that has given me serious pause.
And what do you mean by that?
So the trad narrative, as I understood it in my, in my 20s and 30s, was that it was a bunch of sort of breakaway cranks who couldn't understand that the church had to update itself, right? The aggiornamento, and by going back to the sources, risorsamento, and that these are a bunch of weird people who like to wear doilies on their heads, and they like to have the priest's back turned toward them, mumbling in Latin, and that was the narrative that was sort of given to me. And they breed like rabbits, and they are rigid and probably psychologically broken, right? And that was pretty mainstream in terms of the way that even conservatives thought of the traditional movement. Is that fair, Brett?
I think probably. I didn't have a lot of contact with trads growing up. Like the Canadian prairies was not a hot spot for that.
Yeah.
I
didn't either, Brett. Like that's what I mean. Like I grew up in a very suburban American South, Louisiana, but I didn't know like what the Legionnaires were. They're not trads, but I didn't know what Opus Dei was. They're not trads. Like I didn't know what any of this stuff was. Like at home, you were Catholic or Baptist. Like that was it. And so, but when I did encounter them later on, when I went to a small Catholic college and they had, we used to joke that it was a conservative place. And so, that the college used to advertise in two publications. There were the kids who came to the college because mom and dad read National Review, or there were kids in that college who went to the college because mom and dad read The Wanderer. And The Wanderer, Paul, is this sort of like old school rad trad OG. I think it's still in existence. I don't know, but it's very, very Vatican II skeptic, shall we say? And very much no salvation outside of the actual literal Catholic Church, and that whole bit, right? And so that was my first encounter with them, Brett. And so I wanted to be part of the sort of the urbane, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, conservative, John Paul II type of people. I wasn't dour and make the women dress in prairie skirts and all of that, right? And so anyway, that was sort of my framework for a long, long time. But I have come to think that the liturgical, the Vatican II as liturgy, we'll say, right, has been and the church that birthed it and was birthed by it is deeply problematic. And we lost things. Like, I remember when somebody finally explained to me why the priest has his back facing toward us.
Right.
Because that's how it was always billed to me. It's like, oh, like back then, the priest had his back turned to us. And then when I realized, well, no, actually, that's the priest in front of the congregation offering all of our prayers up and to the Lord to the east. I was like,
role.
whoa, yeah. I'm like, okay, so that's huge. Like, that's not how it was characterized to me at all.
So, I mean, my encounter was a little different because I only met a couple people who were trads that I didn't know what a trad was when I met them. Yeah. And so they made these arguments, that they were aware of what I was supposed to think about them, that I was clueless. I didn't know I was supposed to think that they thought that the priest had his back to us. So I encountered their arguments for Ad Orientem sort of with fresh eyes. And I was never really troubled by that. Like, I was like, oh, yeah, I can see how that works. I mean, like, the metaphor works either way. If a priest is a mediary between God and humanity, well, then whichever way he's facing, you can make a case. Right?
Yeah, I mean, but again, as a traditionally minded sort of Chestertonian conservative, like, don't rip down the wall you run into in the middle of the forest until you know why it's there. But right. I mean, and so my basic standpoint on these things now, even more so, is like, hey, like, how about we not renovate all the churches until we understand why they are like the way they are.
And I think in a lot of ways, I'm sympathetic to like trad aesthetic concerns. I mean, I would share to some degree. What I don't share to a large degree is the moral panic around certain questions. So here's, I mean, a really simple example, right? So the Vatican's nativity scene this year was kind of weird. And my inclination when
it was ugly, Brett. It was ugly.
Sure, it was. So my inclination when I see that is like, that's weird and ugly. But the trad inclination is like, this is a symbol for everything that is wrong, and it's sort of
are they wrong?
Was
I mean, right? I mean, it's a symbol. So I mean, and I'm not a relativist, to be fair, but
so this
it signals.
So I saw it on Rod Dreer's blog, so keep going.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is my temperament.
Sure.
Maybe all it is temperament. I could be down at the priest facing the other way, and I could be down with all the rails, and I like. But I guess I maybe became inoculated from certain experiences of people who overdrew certain lines that I did not find credible or helpful, and so my instinct is to like, ooh, hold on here, what's going on? And to go to my experience of trads, right? So when I met them, I didn't know what they were supposed to be like, and when they made their liturgical arguments, I was like, well, okay, maybe that I'd be okay with that, not a big deal. But then I found, and this is anecdotal, so there will be exceptions to this, but this is my experience. it happened over and over. Here's the weird, in my experience, there are almost no exceptions to this in my tiny subset.
Yeah.
When I met these trads, they were all, well, okay, I met one young woman, basically all young men, and one older man who was a convert to the Catholic Church. And in every single instance, they had broken or non-existent relationships with their own fathers. Every single time.
That's interesting.
And I was like, what is going on here? And what it looked like to me was that these were people in every case, they'd gone through this like searching phase, where maybe they were out in the world, maybe they're atheist or agnostic, maybe they had rejected the Catholicism of their youth or the mainline Protestantism of their youth.
Right.
And then they found in the Catholic Church something from their perspective really rigid, that was willing to take a stand in the world and say the kinds of things that needed to be said that they weren't hearing anywhere else. And what it looks like to me from a psychological point of view is people who found in the church a father instead of a mother.
Well, that's interesting because we always call our Holy Mother Church, right? But anyway.
This is what, when I encountered this like hyper rigidity and this moral panic around things that to me don't seem worthy of that kind of moral panic, I wonder if the church is not a home with a hearth and a mother, but it's a military barracks. And if one hair is out of place, then the sergeant needs to give you a dressing down, right? And it doesn't feel like, even though I might be sympathetic with a lot of I'm on board with the teaching on priesthood and marriage, and I'm not that opposed to liturgy, right? I'm not opposed at all. But it just, the level of moral panic around certain things just seems to me out of all proportion.
Right, because I think you're ultimately messing with people, not you, we are ultimately messing with people's symbols, right? And symbols are visceral. And when I always have to sort of catch myself, am I reacting symbolically to something, or am I reacting like to the person in front of me, right? And we're all married men here. There've certainly been instances where your wife says something that triggers some inner symbol, and you just it unleashes the line, and you sort of like, where did that come from, right? Paul, I think you've even made a couple of jokes about this earlier on, but but when you're messing with people's symbolic imaginarium, or whatever, however you want to call this, the imaginary, as I guess what's his name would say, Taylor would say, that's why I think the liturgical alterations are so consequential. Mm-hmm. And this, Paul, might be where it'd be really interesting to sort of get your perspective, just as in a non quote unquote non-liturgical tradition that you come out of, but I think it really, I think it's the accelerant to so many things. And I'm not a sentimentalist about this. I'm not going to say that, if Pope Francis tomorrow issues some sort of motu proprio about we're all going back to the Latin Mass and we're going back to the extraordinary form and and then everything's going to be fine. I mean, that's
would they all go back?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, right. Is the cat out of the bag, right? Right. And that's why, Paul, I think I've said to you offline a couple of times, like, I sort of think we're all Protestants, actually, because, again, imagine that would be a radical move that would test Catholic ecclesiology to its core, right? And you could mess with little fringe things here and there, but if the Pope said, tomorrow, all right, take out the little mini altar in front of the main altars, going back to the 1962 hymnal, and we're going to do it in Latin, and everybody and the whole thing. I mean, what would happen, Brett? Seriously, what would happen?
Schism.
Totally, like instantaneously.
Well, and this is where Joe Biden comes back into the conversation.
Yeah.
Because not to go too far back to Kennedy, but of course the fear with Kennedy was the Pope will be pulling the strings. Well, you had a sex addict in the White House,
right?
But this is where we're getting into these structures and authority. And okay, so the Pope decides we're going back, and people are like, I'm never going back. It's, you know, it's birth control. You know, and they often go down these lines. I mean, there's very little more powerful in our world than than these sexual issues. They're deeply.
But I'll even go something much more mundane, and I think actually as consequential, if not more. Brad, at what point will the bishops, around the world, Canada, North America, here, at what point are they going to say, okay, as of this date, this coming Sunday after Easter, let's say, all Catholics must return to church at peril of entering into mortal sin.
Right.
If you don't show up.
It's a huge problem. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is,
because for years we all know, like, Paul, maybe you don't know, I don't know this, but like, if I am not in a state of grace, I can't receive communion on Sunday, right? And one of those things that takes me out of communion or puts me in a state of schism from God is missing my Sunday obligation. Now, I don't have to receive in order to make my Sunday obligation, but again, it's always that's the implicit thing. Now, what do you do with this now, Brett? I mean, how do you?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I have this tiny fantasy. I have no idea, right? I remember Archbishop Chaput giving people a dispensation to drink and have meat when St. Patrick's Day landed on a Friday.
Yeah, of course.
And I was like, I know what he's doing here. At least I think I know what he's doing here. They were going to drink and
he's saving Sunday.
Right? And so what was he doing? He was reminding them that they shouldn't be normally. Right? It was
right.
and it
course,
was
yeah.
a huge story. And so I don't know how you pull this off. But perfect world, this extended dispensation due to the pandemic becomes a teaching moment about our Sunday obligation. But how you pull that off, I don't know.
Well, and so we're this is Mardi Gras Day, right? Ash Wednesday's tomorrow, and so watch the theater around this, gentlemen, right? Because we know that they're not going to, most places are not going to do the ashes on the forehead. They're going to sprinkle on top, right? And this is there's all this kind of theater that in this moment, I'm using theater in a very sneering way, so I apologize for my starkiness, but that because this is, this runs the risk. We won't say what that risk is, but with the sprinkle, it's COVID friendly.
And this gets into the question of, okay, what's most real? So So Brett, Kale probably knows this. I mean, I've been following with great interest the migration of Tom Holland through this, and when the pandemic hits, Tom Holland basically looks around, grew up in the Anglican Church at about the age of 6, figured that, hey, wait a minute, dinosaurs aren't in the picture. Dinosaurs are cool. I'm out of here. Eventually writes a book about Islam and its origin story, reads, goes out, and a lot of Muslims are like, you're in trouble. And one of them says, why don't you look into the origin story of your own religion? And what is my religion? And so then he writes this book, Dominion, and becomes, he says I'm the thrush. I'm just in the middle of making this video, actually. I'm sort of the thrush, who's the heir of dinosaurs. And then the pandemic hits, and he looks around at the church and like, we used to call you dinosaurs as sort of to dismiss you.
Right.
But what I would really respect now is someone who would stand up and say, virus be damned, the communion of the saints trumps, masks and social distancing and these things. Now, he nuances that because and this gets into the conversations that you and I have had, Brett, with respect to, is there a God and what does God mean and all of this and agency and all those issues. But these issues come down to, the similar evolution happened in the Christian Reformed Church at the same time as Vatican II. Now, obviously in the 1960s, the Christian Reformed Church is like, papish, and
Sure.
they're not going to go anywhere near a Roman Catholic Church. Kale and I talked about that.
Yeah.
But the same evolution happens, that you would get into serious trouble in the Christian Reformed Church in the 50s if you missed 2 or 3 weeks in a row. You would get a visit from the elders.
Right,
You were barking. You were getting towards church discipline line. Today,
I was struck by that. You mentioned that one of the marks is church discipline in your last one. Yeah, right.
And so a guy like Tom Holland, who basically says, if you ask me per se, do I believe in God? No, not really. Do I believe in he doesn't answer. Nobody's asked him that question directly.
Right.
Did Jesus actually walk out of that tomb?
Right.
You look at a guy like Jordan Peterson, but these people are sort of coming back in via the story verse and longing for it to be true and waiting for Christians to stand up and say, hey, I'll take a bullet for this. Suddenly they look around at the trads and they say, at least these people act like it's real. And whatever you think of John MacArthur in Southern California and all of the stuff going on with him, people look around and say, some people look around and say, those fool idiots, of course they're getting COVID in church. But others are looking at them and say, at least these people actually believe it. And most of the rest of those people, they're just playing games and they're trying to prop up the brand against a losing wave.
Thank you. And that has been so much a part of my own personal, I have assented to, Brett, you're a transubstantiation expert. Like, I have assented to that since I was 19 years old, right? I believe that, but as I get older and as my children are getting older, I want to be amongst a group of people who at least look like they believe that this is Jesus on the altar. And the group that I see who look like they believe it. And again, I know and I'm a pretty skeptical guy. Like, I'm watching, right? At least the trads actually believe in it. And that's just moving to me personally. So when I go to a Latin Mass, and I go to a Novus Ordo Mass, and it's reverent and all that nice stuff. But when I go to a Latin Mass, those rare occasions which I do, like, I'm looking around, the kids and the parents and and they approach that altar in fear and trembling, like nobody's business. Not like the local suburban parish where, kids are checking their iPhone, literally checking their iPhone on the way up, and then they go like this and they take it and they may, they so blasé, right? Trads aren't blasé about the Eucharist.
Right. And I think in general, this is right. Trad young people mystify people 10 years older than me and older.
Yeah.
Kind of think like, how is it? Because you and I, Kale, grew up with the narrative, the John Paul II and into Benedict narrative. But people 10 years, 20 years older than I grew up where John Paul and Benedict were already, they were the ones who were wrecking things, right?
That's right.
So they were sort of waiting that out, hoping for, whether Francis is actually that or just,
I think they got their guy. They got their guy.
Right. Whatever, however you want to play
That's
that.
fine. I don't want to put you on the spot.
We could have a other discussion about that. But my point was, when they see a young person attracted to something like, that's a Freudian slip. Attracted to something like traditional liturgy. That's where the ad came from traditional. Addicted traditional. They're baffled. They say, what is this? And I think largely from a sociological point of view, right? Forget theology or whatever else for now. From a sociological point of view, we have basically taken out all the roots that any young people in humanity have relied upon, whether that's family, culture, religion, language. We've taught everyone how to deconstruct everything without putting anything in its place.
Right, and that's the patrimony that I was bemoaning in my piece, Paul. That was exactly the sadness that I was trying to give voice to.
And when you teach people deconstruction and nothing constructive in its place, there's all kinds of things out there that will be attractive to them. I mean, why did so many vaguely Muslim or non-Muslim, North Americans who lived in their mom's basement think they wanted to go fight for ISIS because they had nothing.
Yeah,
they had nothing.
This is Wellebec, right?
This mattered.
This is the Wellebec, the French novelist's point, right?
Right.
You know, it's like, it reminds me of that line, you know, Walter Sobchak says in the movie, you know, say what you will about the tenets of National Socialism, but at least it had an ethos, right? And it's like, you know, it was a joke in the movie. What's the movie? Help me out. What's the movie? It's a Coen Brothers movie. I've seen it a million times. But right, I mean, the whole idea is that, you know, say what you, and again, darkly, I repeat this darkly, but say what you will about the tenets of ISIS, at least it had an ethos, right? Which is just devastatingly frightening to somebody like me. Like, that's so sad that actually these kids have inherited such a meaningless universe that they would revert to something as evil as ISIS, because at least it gives them spirit and meaning.
And for me, this goes back to, you know, speaking as I'm not a bishop, we don't have bishops in the Christian Reformed Church. One of my friends calls me a bishop because I'm of a certain age and have a degree of influence.
That's
but
great.
The world, in many ways, the patient root of wisdom certainly has its merit, to your point, Brett. And I think that's exactly right, where we're watching things pop on social media, and patient wisdom says, we're going to see a lot of popping here. That's part of the social media going on. And there certainly is a sense in which we have to weather such storms. But on the other hand, I think in many ways, the world is waiting for the church to stand and deliver. And that is, you know, I would, Brett, I want to really make this point gently. When you were talking about the trads and you made the observation that many of these individuals, you know, didn't, you know, had broken or non-existent relationships with their own fathers. I mean, that's a deconstruction move. And you may be right, but, and so the kind of worldview we need to inhabit needs to, you know, we have to, in some ways, handle deconstruction. And this is part of what I've seen in some of these new movements of Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson, where you can say, someone might say, you know, I have had a broken or non-existent relationship with my father. And certainly maybe that's what drew me to the trad. And of course, those who took down the towers and joined ISIS were young men, raised middle-class men from Europe and America who had Western educations and had everything was deconstructed and they had nothing. And maybe some who Jordan Peterson caught their ear and they were ready to stand. But, you know, the world waits for the church, for those moments where the church stands and delivers and is ready to draw a line and say, this is my line. And
I think the operative movie remains. I mean, all these years later, you know, the Fight Club, you know, that there's something attractive about the masculine spirit, you know, and I'm not like some manosphere guy, but you know, that I'm struck that Brett makes the point about the broken relationship with fathers, and I would just simply counter with it, right? And so that they're looking for a father who keeps his promises. You know, I'm watching Cobra Kai with my kids right now, which is a little bit on the edge of appropriateness for my youngest, but anyway, you know, and it's so much about broken fatherhood. And
sappy and the
but it works.
I'm addicted to the dumb thing. Like, oh, why would I love this? But there it totally is.
But getting to the, you know, it's a father who, I mean, look, that is the great promise of our faith. It's a father who keeps his promises. It's the covenant, right? And we have so many uncovenanted folks, you know, people who are struggling. So. I need to remember that. That's a.
Well, I mean, Fred, you know, my liberal within the Overton window. I mean, you know, I am often asked about church teaching on reserving priesthood to ordination of priesthood to men. And I agree with and support the church's teaching, but I also need to try to find a way to say it to people in contemporary society who can make some sense out of it. And the one thing I've found for certain audiences is that it like we live in a society that's taken away all the fathers.
Yeah.
And if the Catholic Church were to like, let's even I think the Catholic Church can't change this teaching, but let's imagine hypothetically that it could change the teaching. I think this historical moment would be the worst possible time, because it would be a capitulation to the total absence of fathers in culture and society, and like healthy relationships with dads has been shown to be so important for everything from incarceration to teen pregnancy to drug use to depression to like everything. You know, a healthy relationship with your dad, and we are systematically undermining it, even to the point of changing our words so that people can't talk about males. As
correct.
You know,
And to add on to that, I mean, I think when I talk to my friends who, I have friends who have been through the seminary and have left in good terms. I have friends who have gone through the whole process and have been ordained. I have friends who have been through the process and gotten really quite hurt by the experience. And one of the things that I underestimated as a layman was the role of the bishop as the father to his priests. And, I have seen real damage done to young men, now older men, because I'm no longer a young man, of those people who entered into what they thought was going to be, a father-son relationship that would foster their vocation, but in essence, it was a mechanism for abuse, and like that's one of those sort of profound moments where you recognize that the symbol of fatherhood is not just. It's not just like this thing. It's real. To keep going back to your, what I keep fixating on the same thing, Paul. But like, what is real? And we know that fatherhood is real, and we step off of that at our own peril, so that you can't say the word masculinity now in the public square without saying toxic first. Yeah. And like, what is that going to do?
I'm curious to know a little more about what you mean by abuse. I mean, I've heard of some stories.
Not just sexual. Yeah. I don't mean.
The stories I would have some familiarity with, if abuse could be used accurately, it would be something like neglect.
Right. Or look, we all know that when a young man or a man signs up to be a priest in a diocese, that you are giving yourself over fully to the discretion of your bishop, right? And so your sovereignty is in essence given over. And so when that person takes that gift and does right by it and fosters the gifts of the young man, that's great. But when that's an abuser, and I'm not meaning merely sexually here or at all. I mean, what if that man's an alcoholic? What if that man's neglect? I mean, they're all manner of ways in which, and look, I live at a monastery, so it's the same thing. What if the abbot is an abusive abbot? It's when that thing gets captured, it's not that the thing itself is not real. It's that when it becomes captured and counterfeited, that is when it has deep reverberations into the body of Christ.
And that's the crisis of Ravi Zacharias.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
He's not a bishop,
Right.
but in the evangelical marketplace where you don't have a structure, celebrity mediates the church hierarchy.
Yeah.
And however poorly that celebrity is established. But in Ravi Zacharias' case, he was above average in terms of that particular class of individual, and everybody knew it.
Yeah.
So, and that is when the fathers of the church fail to adequately represent and embody our Father in heaven, the whole church is going to be in crisis. Mother Church is going to be in crisis. I wish we had Mary Cohen here in this conversation because she's another person on my channel, but at a Roman Catholic.
Here's a future, I don't know if it's a future conversation or not, but it's something that occurs.
Well, we have to land the plane, but I sure want to talk to you two again.
I'm game.
What is going to go well?
Yeah.
Well, so here's a kind of closing thought from me, because I think the fatherhood question is really interesting. And one of the things that strikes me, I mean, Pope Francis just declared a year of St. Joseph. And I at first I was like, okay, St. Joseph, that's cool. I'll learn more about St. Joseph. And then as I had my first couple of conversations with people about the year of St. Joseph, including with someone who had a very serious relationship with St. Joseph, and that was part of his coming back into the church and all that kind of thing.
Are you talking Joseph, Mary, Joseph, Jesus?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I just want to be sure which Joseph here.
So in the Catholic Church, we do years, the Jubilee year of this or that. We do year of faith, year of, year of the priest. So Pope Francis declared a year of St. Joseph. And I, at first it didn't, land on me as like terribly significant. But then as I've been thinking about the crisis of fatherhood in society and in the church, I wondered if that was not exactly what we needed. And I think it's probably worth, Catholic thinkers exploring Joseph and fatherhood this year.
I love St. Joseph. I'm a huge fan. But remember that he's also marking the anniversary of Amoris. He announced a couple of days later, so which will bring all of the fights right back out to the fore.
What does that mean? You have to translate that to Protestant for me.
Go ahead, Brett.
Kale.
Oh, well, Amoris Laetitia was the post-apostolic exhortation after the Synod of Bishops on the family, and
otherwise known in trad circles as the nuclear bomb.
Yeah, and it was extremely controversial, largely, though not exclusively, around the question of whether divorced and remarried might ever approach the table for communion. So that's become a sort of flashpoint in Francis's papacy. But
yeah.
Well,
so anyway, I'm being that jerk guy. I'm sorry.
but and again, as someone who, even in the living stones, I understand responsibility, and I understand balance and having to do two things at once. If you're responsible for almost anything of any size, you've always got, I'm going to do this, that's going to tick these people. I'm going to do this, that's going to tick these. Maybe if I tick them off equally, we'll all be able to still live together. But
so, Paul, the question is, do you strategically tick people off or not? That's my question to you as a pastor.
At times, yes. there are times when certain groups need to be ticked off a little bit.
Maybe so.
But this again, and we do have to land the plane. But this does get back to this question of authority and structures, and keeping up the brand often means, if you're a YouTuber who does not hold clerical office or ecclesiastical office, you're just responsible to the algorithm. But if you actually have a position in a group where there's a diversity of opinion on any subject, and you have multiple diversities of opinions on multiple subjects, you think strategically at a different level, and because your motivation is, let's try to keep the family together. And that sort of lands someone into, you brought up the mission, where okay, in a case like that, do we threaten war between Spain and Portugal? There's something to think about. And so words matter. But again, we just had a presidency with someone for whom let's say Trump used words. Trump was brilliant in many respects. He used words in different ways than any other president we ever had.
Yeah,
and I don't mean that flippantly.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Because, for Trump, I remember watching him come down the escalator thinking, roll my eyes with everyone else. It wasn't too many primaries and no one was rolling eyes anymore. And Trump, of course, was bred in that world. And so nobody could take him on. And even given a pandemic, he didn't lose by much. Yeah. So, again, to circle back to what we talked about before, we're dealing with forces and factors that in many ways are way beyond us, and that we ought to have a sobriety and a seriousness about these issues that I'm sure your bishop has, Brett, and I have as a pastor, because we see the cost in people's lives of, there's a young woman in my church who has taken to giving little things on social media quite regularly, and I see the cost in her life of that. And so that's what we're living in and dealing with. So
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to thank you both. This has been, if you got a last word, Brett, you can go ahead and.
Oh, I was just going to say, I question myself. This is going to sound crazy. I question if I trust the Holy Spirit almost too much. I mean, I have a kind of equanimity around things a lot of the time. And I wonder, like, should I be more panicked?
Your parents just didn't divorce.
Maybe that's all it was. But yeah, like.
Mine either, as I have that same equanimity.
Francis says some things that I wouldn't say. And I'm like, well, he'll be Pope for a while. He says some other things I really like. And I don't know. People seem to be either really worked up one way or the other, and I don't seem to be. I don't know what's wrong with me. Maybe.
I rate
maybe nothing.
So there's another YouTuber who actually doesn't live far from me. He's the Distributist. He's a conservative Roman Catholic.
Of course, yeah.
And so he and I had a conversation once, and in some ways he's running around like his hair's on fire, and I'm like, I got no hair, but and so yeah, my parents had a wonderful relationship. So we're all trying to calibrate this world, and we have to include that psychological layer and the family I grew up in and the people who are from broken homes, and do we know what everybody thinks? And I mean, we have touched so many things that were so helpful in this conversation. I do want to thank you both.
My pleasure. I loved it. Thank you, Paul.
It was great. Great to meet you, Kale.
Thanks, same, Brett.
For having both of us. Yeah, I'd love to do it again.
I'm gonna stop the recording, and so thank you both.